The six-foul limit, controlling physical attrition. In the earliest years of the NBA, physical play was virtually left unchecked. There were scenarios where defenders could push, hit, or even impede ball handlers with no severe consequences. Fouls often get accumulated, but removal from the game was mostly inconsistent. The consequences of this was that star players were often subjected to repeated punishment, while games on the other end frequently turned into endurance contests instead of skill display. No doubt, the NBA acknowledged the gap and addressed it by establishing a six-foul disqualification limit in the 1940s. The rule stated that once a player committed 6 personal fouls, they are to be removed from the game. The six-foul rule brought about immediate consequences for the over-aggressive defense. At this point, teams had to manage players' minutes strategically, while coaches on the other end were made to account for foul trouble and also adjust rotations. Within a time frame, the defensive aggression became more calculated rather than recklessness. The six-foul limit went on to protect scorers from wearing down, while maintaining physicality as part of the game. In the long run, the six-foul limit made players, coaches, and franchises sit up. The lane violation free throw rule. Wilt at the line. Despite Wilt Chamberlain's exceptionalness in the league, however, people found faults in his free throws. The NBA is a deal, and people want to make sure everything is fair. Wilt Chamberlain's free throw skills were a problem because they found a loophole in the rules of free throw shooting in the history of the NBA. In the early 1960s, Wilt began taking running starts on free throws, sprinting forward and using momentum to dunk or lay the ball in after release. This was allowed by the rules, however, it was not really fair. The way he did it made free throws more about tricks than skill, and this gave him an advantage over other players. It made people talk about what's fair and what is not in the game of free throws. The tactic he used on throws was the main issue. However, the NBA reacted by banning momentum-based free throws in the league. The players shooting the ball on the side had to stay still behind the line until the ball was out of their hands. This rule about not stepping over the line when shooting free throws made sure that free throws were about being gentle and precise, not about being really athletic. This way, free throws were what they were meant to be. Even though the league made some changes, Wilt still scored a lot of points, but not as functional as he was before the adjustment. Following his early seasons where he briefly shot 62%, his accuracy dipped, with his 12-year average dipping to 47%. Wilt continued to dominate in spite of the adjustment, thereby averaging more than 50 points per game during the 1961-1962 campaign. The rules for defense, when isolation became mandatory. Before 2001, the NBA drew a stringent line for the prohibited zone defenses in the league. Defenders were often required to maintain their assigned player or probably provide help in certain situations. But the NBA had intended to support offensive freedom and scoring in the league, but the same rule had certain consequences. It went on to create isolated heavy offenses and rigid defensive patterns. Without the rule, teams were exploiting spacing rules, thereby leaving certain skills like off-ball movement and fast breaks underutilized in the league. However, as the league evolved, players and coaches were faced with these limitations. In order to restore a proper structure for games to flow easily, the NBA gradually relaxed the enforcement in 2001 and replaced it with the defensive 3 seconds. The new rules allowed the core elements of zone principles while still protecting offensive spacing in the league. With this new adjustment, the game shifted towards more of a dynamic system. Players gained more passing angles and more off-ball movement, while coaches could easily strategize and innovate with the rule, giving them the flexibility to introduce rotations without violating rules. Despite the rule bringing back some core dynamic skill back to the game, isolation still existed, but it was more of a tool rather than a default tactic. The ELAM ending rejection, preserving identity. The ELAM ending got big through TBT, then the NBA tried it for All-Star games. The end result was for it to stop all that intentional fouling that makes fourth quarters drag on forever. But the NBA said no to using it in regular games. League executives really dug into this, went on to study whether fans liked it more or if it actually made games better. Their conclusion was that the game clock is basketball and they can't mess with that. According to the ELAM ending, a ticking clock creates a specific type of drama. But the NBA went with smaller fixes. They tweaked clear path foul rules, changed penalties for fouling away from the ball, refined the hack-a-player stuff, thereby keeping the games moving without throwing out the clock entirely. It was almost impossible for the league to rewrite basketball in order to fix a tactical problem. It wasn't worth it. so they had to maintain the traditional structure and tighten rules, so it became almost impossible for teams to exploit them. The NBA went on to settle for adjustments rather than rewriting the game system. If you're enjoying this, subscribe and drop a like. Thanks. Coaches' challenges. Accountability enforced. The replay option has existed in shards across the NBA for several decades. For accountability purposes, officials evaluated last-second shots and clock violations when needed, but the majority of in-game rulings were quite definitive, even when slow-motion replays clearly contradicted them. Missed calls affected playoff series, it swung momentum, and damaged officiating confidence, most especially when broadcasts revealed those errors immediately. But as time went on, the league was faced with an increasing credibility gap between what officials saw in real time and what fans viewed at home. The NBA implemented the Coaches' Challenge in 2019, giving room for each club an opportunity per game to challenge a referee's decision using instant replay. Technical errors like personal fouls, out-of-bounds violations, and rulings involving goaltending or basket interference were all eligible calls. The NBA went on to put in place a rule that established accountability without handing over control of the game to replay officials or technology. No doubt, challenges were purposefully constrained, and coaches had to use a timeout to initiate a review, and an unsuccessful challenge could cost a game timeout indefinitely. This framework prohibited frivolous use while maintaining game rhythm. However, despite the coach's challenge, decisions were still made by referees, but with visual confirmation, which reduced the margin for error. As time went on, coaches grew more selective. Athletes, on the other hand, responded to more scrutiny, and officials exercised increased monitoring rather than lesser authority. The restricted arc area. Redefining the charge. For several decades in the history of the NBA, drawing a charge near the basket was more about bravery rather than precision. Defenders often sneak underneath soaring players at the last second, resulting in collisions that were both dangerous and difficult to call. And as athletes grew quicker, stronger, and more explosive, these collisions became even more dangerous. Star players who attacked the rim were often subjected to unforeseen contact, which frequently resulted in injuries that may change their careers. However, the NBA responded in 1997 by establishing the restricted arc area, a semicircle beneath the hoop where defenders could no longer draw charging fouls if they were inside it. The goal was quite simple: reduce ambiguity while also protecting both players and the game's integrity. Officials had a clear understanding of the restricted arc areas, while teams had to reconsider certain defensive placement and rotations. It made offensive players feel more confident in their attacks. By 2010, the league had adjusted the arc's dimensions and established clear enforcement methods, which helps defenders learn how to anticipate angles without depending on last-minute undercuts. On the other side, offensive spacing improved and rim attacks became much more reliable. The rule reframed risk management rather than eliminating the rim protection, although collisions still occur, but now in a more controlled way. The take foul, when transition was being sabotaged. Transition basketball, which is quick, instinctual, and advantage-driven, has long been a distinguishing aspect of the game. For years, teams realized they could counteract this by fouling players away from the ball on open-court fast breaks. These fouls were completely legal and quite effective, but they slowed the game, disrupted rhythm, and upset spectators. The NBA acknowledged that fan engagement and competitive integrity were being jeopardized, and in response, the league implemented the take foul rule in 2022. Intentional fouls during open court transition now result in not only free throws, but also possession for the fouled team. The NBA carefully adjusted the regulation to deter exploitative behavior while protecting genuine defensive techniques. It was no doubt a surgical adjustment where offensive and defensive freedom persisted, but repeated exploitation was no longer an option in the game. The result was quite immediate as fast breaks resurfaced, and players who attacked the rim quickly were no longer discouraged by premeditated fouls. Coaching techniques also evolved as defenders changed their angles and anticipation to prevent giving up points and possessions. The take foul rule went on to reinforce an NBA principle. Rules are more than simply about fairness. They also serve to keep the spectacle going, anytime, any day. The 14-second shot clock reset, speed as policy. For decades, every offensive rebound reset the shot clock to 24 seconds. It seems fair in theory, but this only resulted in stagnation. repeated possessions that lasted considerably longer than when necessary, thereby slowing down the pace of game and lowering the frequency of meaningful scoring opportunities. The NBA later realized that the solution was a minor but precise tweak, and in 2018, the league altered the rule, which stated that after an offensive rebound, the shot clock would reset to 14 seconds instead of 24. The premise was quite straightforward but did maintain offensive opportunities while requiring faster action. Teams on the other end still had second chances, but hesitancy to it definitely comes with a price. Decisions about whether to pass, drive, or shoot required quickness and clarity. At this point, rebounding becomes more than just a means of delay, while coaches modified strategies to maximize offensive boards. The adjustment went on to boost possessions per game, quickened pace, and promoted attacking skill. The 14-second reset was a balance between risk and reward, while maintaining continuity in the game. Freedom of movement, the second hand check war. Perimeter defense had subtly changed by the middle of the 2000s to accommodate the league's hand check regulations. Defenders used quick grabs, hip checks, forearm bumps, and off-ball contact to disrupt ball handlers' timing, rather than extending their arms. The strategies were frequently disregarded, as possessions slowed down and spacing gave way. Even before plays could even start, offenses had to battle through contact. The NBA was able to uncover the root cause. Skill was being penalized before it could be demonstrated at any level of the game. Shooters, on the other hand, struggled to separate. Cutters were diverted off their lines, and creators often encountered resistance away from the ball, rather than at the moment of attack. At this point, defense has moved from containment to obstruction, but the league decided to enforce and adjust the game, instead of introducing a new rule. Beginning in 2018, the NBA prioritized freedom of movement, asking officials to call non-ball fouls more consistently in games, holding, grasping, rerouting cutters, and making illegal physical contact during screenings of more focal points. Actions that were previously considered as gray areas were now reclassified as infractions. Referees were educated to penalize interference early in possessions rather than waiting at the catch. The goal was preventive officiating. Stop contact before it dictated outcomes. Defenders could still contest shots and fight through screens, but they could no longer manipulate space with their hands or leverage. The league restored balance by protecting motion over possession. Games were now faster, cleaner, and more visually appealing at this point. Malice at the Palace. When safety forced governance, the Detroit Pistons and Indiana Pacers faced off in a game that would change NBA governance on November 19, 2004. A confrontation on the court spilled into the stands, where players and spectators clashed physically. The incident resulted in injuries, public outrage, and intensive media investigation. The league was facing an existential credibility crisis. Basketball had become more than just entertainment. It was also a safety concern. The NBA acted decisively. Some key players were suspended, some for the entirety of the season. This was beyond immediate disciplinary action. Systemic improvements were implemented almost immediately. Security protocols have been improved. The alcohol sales policies were strengthened. The league provided additional training for venue personnel. The clothing code, implemented in 2005, was intended to professionalize the league's image and avoid distractions. Structured improvements were implemented in addition to immediate disciplinary measures. Security protocols on the other end were updated, and the league alcohol policies were adjusted to more stricter standards. The league went on to provide expanded arena personnel training, and the clothing code, which was implemented in 2005, and it was intended to professionalize the league's image and avoid distractions in the modern era. The rules got stretched beyond the play on the court. It went on to encompass culture, perception, conduct, safety, and professionalism. The NBA conveyed a clear message to the league. Behavior off the ball, off the floor, and among spectators was just as important as performance. Rules could no longer be limited to points or fouls. They needed to address the sports ecosystem, as everyone's safety was a priority. There you have it, incredible fans of the NBA. Do let me know in the comment section below which of these rules adjustments got to you the most. Also, do not hesitate to smash that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell icon, and also like this video.